Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix Chapter 5 The Order of the Phoenix. I can only say that up until now, there haven't been any mysterious deaths, Sirius said. In any case, we can't know everything, but we've learned a lot. From many perspectives, we know more than that person does. Lupin thought so, too, and added, so why did he stop killing? Harry asked. He knew what he was waiting for. Voldemort murdered last year. That was because he didn't want to, Sirius said. Now it's also very dangerous for him. His recovery hasn't gone as well as he expected. You understand. Things were messed up by me. My fate is that you messed things up for him. Lupin smiled with satisfaction. What do you mean? Harry asked, confused. You unexpectedly survived, Sirius said. Besides, none of his followers except the Death Eaters knew about his return. But you came down and became a witness. What's more, the person he least wanted to inform was Dumbledore, Lupin said. But you let Dumbledore know immediately. What's the benefit of this? Are you kidding? Everyone knows that Dumbledore is the only one the Dark Lord is afraid of, Sirius explained. Thank you for the explanation, Lupin said. Within an hour of Voldemort's return, Dumbledore had reassembled the Order of the Phoenix, Sirius said. The Order of the Phoenix has been working in secret since then. You see, Harry, Voldemort can't carry out his plans without it, Lupin said. How did you know Voldemort's plans? Harry quickly asked. Dumbledore has a source, Lupin said. And his sources are usually reliable. So Dumbledore believes Voldemort's plans involve rebuilding his army, Sirius said. In the coming days, he will recruit a large number of members, either deceived or following him out of fear. His loyal Death Eaters are not the only ones he relies on, there are many other dark creatures. Have you heard of his attempts to recruit giants? There were once followers who were with him, too, Lupin said. But Voldemort is not entirely sure he can rely solely on his Death Eaters to overthrow the Ministry of Magic. So you're trying to stop more followers from joining him? Harry asked. We're doing our best, Lupin replied. The main task is to figure out how many people truly want to return to Voldemort's side and then keep them under surveillance. That's smart, said Harry. This strategy has proven effective because of the Ministry of Magic, Sirius said. You've seen Fudge. He panicked after hearing the rumors of Voldemort's return. He doesn't want to believe that anything has happened. But Harry, why is he so stupid? Harry asked in frustration. If Dumbledore is right about everything, why doesn't he understand? Sirius said with a bitter smile, because Fudge is afraid of Dumbledore. Fudge is afraid of Dumbledore? Harry asked, bewildered. Why would Fudge be afraid of Dumbledore? Lupin said, the Weasleys think that Fudge believes Dumbledore is secretly plotting to become Minister of Magic, but Dumbledore has never wanted that. Of course he doesn't, Sirius said. He was offered the position many times, even after Bagman retired, but he never wanted it. Fudge, on the other hand, always thought Dumbledore was more popular than him. Despite Dumbledore never campaigning for it, Fudge always felt overshadowed by him. Now, it seems Fudge has become infatuated with power and is increasingly convinced that Dumbledore is just a troublemaker. He likes his current position and is beginning to see Dumbledore as an obstacle. You see, Harry, the problem is that Fudge refuses to acknowledge Voldemort's return, because doing so would mean the Ministry would have to deal with a crisis unlike any they've faced in the last 14 years, Sirius said grimly. Fudge just doesn't want to face it. To him, it's easier to delude himself into thinking Dumbledore is lying than to face the truth, Lupin added, but without evidence of any threat from Voldemort, it's hard to convince people that he's back, especially when they don't want to believe it, Lupin continued. The Ministry has restricted the Daily Prophet from reporting anything from Dumbledore, so most of the wizarding community has no idea what's happening. If the Death Eaters use the Imperious Curse, the powerful mind control spell Voldemort used before, which is one of the 3 unforgivable curses banned by the Ministry, then it would be easy to gain control. But you are trying to get the word out, aren't you? Harry asked, looking at Sirius, Bill, Lupin, and Tonks. Yes, but when everyone thinks I'm a mad killer with a bounty of 1,000 galleons on my head, it's hard, Sirius said anxiously. And I'm an unwelcome guest in most communities, Lupin said. Being a werewolf is a dangerous occupation. Tonks and Arthur would lose their jobs at the Ministry if they got too involved. And I'm sure Voldemort is aiming for them as well. We've been trying to convince everyone not to be too conspicuous, Tonks said. Last time the Order of the Phoenix was assembled, there were Aura members, including one responsible for capturing Sirius. That's why the Ministry has been spreading the false news that Sirius is in Tibet. But if none of you have spread the news about Voldemort's return, then who has? Harry asked. Who says we haven't? Sirius replied. Why do you think Dumbledore is in so much trouble? You mean they're trying to discredit Dumbledore? Harry asked. Didn't you see last week's Daily Prophet? They reported that Dumbledore has been voted out as president of the International Confederation of Wizards, because they believe he's lost control, Lupin said. That's not true, is it? Harry asked. After he announced Voldemort's return, he was ignored by the Ministry. They demoted his wizarding status from Supreme Mugwump to Ordinary Wizard, Lupin concluded. This is the highest honor for a wizard, and they are now discussing revoking his Order of Merlin. The Order of Merlin is a symbol of supreme authority in the magical world, akin to the Taoist deity the Supreme Lord Lao, or the Buddhist Tathagata. The Order of Merlin has appeared in many related novels. Although no one has seen Merlin in real life, he has been a legendary figure. However, Dumbledore mentioned that he doesn't care what they do as long as they don't remove him from the chocolate frog cards. Fred laughed and said, "This isn't funny, Weasley." Someone sharply commented, if he continues to openly defy them, he might end up in Azkaban, and all we can do is support Dumbledore. If that man knew Dumbledore was back on the battlefield, he'd be more cautious. If Dumbledore leaves the battle, that man will be in trouble. But if Voldemort recruits more followers, then his return would be inevitable. Harry felt disappointed, thinking that Voldemort wouldn't openly break into a place in broad daylight, as Sirius said. He's a master of secrecy, and in any case, his followers are his only concern. Sirius and Lupin exchanged a quick glance before responding, saying that they would replenish supplies through secret channels. Harry looked puzzled, but Sirius seemed like a weapon of sorts, something he didn't have the last time. Before he grows stronger, he must gain some sort of weapon. Harry asked quickly, what kind of weapon? Sirius responded, something worse than the 3 unforgivable curses, Mrs. Weasley, who had been standing by the door, sternly called the boys to bed after listening to their conversation. Harry hadn't noticed how serious she looked until now. Everyone, go to bed immediately, no more talking, she ordered as they reached the first floor. We have a lot to do tomorrow, and I hope today has been enough. Fred and George, already heading upstairs, hadn't been listening, but they knew it was time to go to bed. If we don't go to bed now, you'll regret not telling us everything we've been discussing downstairs, Mrs. Weasley warned, now serious. They went to bed, but Harry felt like a failure, following them upstairs to bed. The room looked darker than when they first saw it, with shadows moving slowly as if the unseen occupant was asleep. Harry, in his pajamas, climbed into bed, and while Ron put the owl cage on top of the wardrobe, calming the restless pigwidgeon, who was fluttering his wings nervously. We can't let them out to hunt every night, Ron complained as she put on her green pajamas. Dumbledore doesn't want too many owls flying around the square, it looks too suspicious. She locked the door as she spoke. Why are you doing that? Creature asked as he turned off the lights. Believe me, you don't want to be woken up in the middle of the night to find that guy in your room, Creature said as he climbed into bed. The moonlight shining through the dirty window allowed Harry to see Ron's outline. What are you thinking about, Harry? Ron asked. Yes, they didn't tell us much, but we can guess, Harry said, recalling their conversation downstairs. All they really told us is that the Order of the Phoenixe is trying to organize people against Voldemort. A sharp cry came from somewhere nearby, causing Harry to pause. When are you planning to go to school? Lupin asked Sirius. Yes, but only after the meeting, Sirius responded. Harry felt a mix of gratitude and understanding toward Sirius and Lupin, although Ron didn't hear the last part. You're right, Ron said, we already know everything they've told us, and we found out everything else using extendable ears. I haven't heard of a single thing that we didn't already know, Harry said quietly. Your mother might come back and check on us, so we should stop talking now. All right, said Fred, and in the darkness, apparition is more dangerous, Harry added. Fred and George's blurry outlines could be seen on the other side of the room. As George sat down at the foot of the bed, Harry's mattress dipped slightly. Did you see that thing? George asked eagerly. Sirius's secret weapon. Harry replied. What could it be? Fred continued, but nothing in this world is worse than Avada Kedavra. That spell is one of the 3 unforgivable curses. When Voldemort used it on Harry, it almost killed him, leaving only a lightning-shaped scar. It's even worse, Ron said. What could be worse than death? Maybe it's something that can torture you to death, or kill in a particularly painful way, Ron said heavily. Voldemort already has 2 of the 3 unforgivable curses, Harry said. The Cruciator's curse can cause unbearable pain, but won't let you die. We wouldn't need to laugh at such a thing, Harry replied. Others would find that strange in any case. So who do you think has this weapon now? George asked. I hope it's on our side, Ron said, feeling a bit nervous and fidgety. If that's the case, Dumbledore might have hidden it, Fred suggested. Where would he hide it? Ron quickly asked. Probably at Hogwarts, George said. That's where Dumbledore hid the Sorcerer's Stone. But a weapon would be different from a stone, right? Yes, size isn't the only factor when it comes to power, Fred said. Just look at today's events. What do you mean? Harry asked. Your dad has never had to flex his muscles much with magic, right? Fred said, sitting up in bed as footsteps were heard coming up the stairs. Mom, George said, almost immediately, followed by a loud bang. Harry felt the bed shake under him. A few seconds later, they heard the floor creak outside the door as Mrs. Weasley was listening in, checking if they were still talking. The silence was broken by Harry loudly shouting in protest. The floor creaked again, and they heard Mrs. Weasley going upstairs to check on Fred and George. You know, she completely doesn't trust us, Ron said. Harry found himself unable to sleep. There were too many things to think about from that night, so he hoped to stay awake for a few more hours. He wanted to keep talking with Ron, but because of Mrs. Weasley's footsteps, they had to remain quiet. It was clear that no one else was sleeping. Many creatures with multiple legs were softly running around outside the bedroom door. The Care of Magical Creatures class had mentioned them being nearby. They are quite troublesome, aren't they? Harry said. We'll learn more about these kinds of weapons this term. Harry then saw one of the creatures aim its head through the crack in the door at him. He quickly ducked down, and the next thing he knew, he was tangled in his warm bedsheets. Then, a loud voice filled the room. Wake up. Your breakfast is in the kitchen, Mrs. Weasley said. Afterward, she wants you to stay in the drawing room. There was a large amount of dust on the ground, much more than she expected, and she found dead creatures under the sofa. Half an hour later, Harry and Ron quickly got dressed, had breakfast, and went to the drawing room. This was a long room on the first floor with a high ceiling. Dust floated down from the thick curtains that covered the walls, forming clouds of dust whenever someone walked on the floor. Green velvet drapes covered the windows, which were being cleaned. Inside, the large, unseen Mrs. Weasley, Hermione, Fred, and George were all there. They had wrapped cloths around their noses and mouths, looking quite peculiar, and each of them held a large bottle with a black nozzle. "Cover your faces and grab a spray bottle," Mrs. Weasley said as she saw Harry and Ron, giving them 2 larger bottles filled with a black liquid. "This is serious. I haven't seen such a severe infestation in over 10 years. Those little pests must have been hiding somewhere." She glared at Harry, who could clearly see Mrs. Weasley giving him a reproachful look. "It's just too much," she added. "Perhaps Creature couldn't manage things, but you'd be surprised to see how capable he is when he wants to be." The person speaking was Sirius. He had just entered the room carrying a blood-soaked bundle full of dead rats. "I've just been feeding Buckbeak, the hippogriff that was on the run with us before." "He's in the upstairs room," Sirius replied in response to inquiries. "I left it upstairs, in my mother's room." "Never mind," he said, tossing the bundle into an armchair and then checking a locked cabinet. Harry noticed that the cabinet was shaking slightly. "Maybe we should let me take a look before we open it," Sirius suggested cautiously. "That's a good idea," Mrs. Weasley replied. Both of them spoke politely and carefully, clearly showing Harry that neither had forgotten last night's argument. A loud clanging bell suddenly rang from downstairs, followed by Creature's shrill screech. "That's what happens when you press the doorbell," Sirius grumbled as he ran out of the room in a hurry. They heard his footsteps and the loud voice of Mrs. Black screaming again, "You shame the family, you blood traitor. Shut that door." "Harry, close the drawing room door," Mrs. Weasley instructed. Harry took some time to close the drawing room door, trying to listen to what was happening downstairs. Sirius had apparently tried hard to close the door, as Mrs. Black had finally stopped screaming. Harry heard Sirius step out of the hall, followed by the sound of chains clinking. Then he heard something that he thought was the sound of a vanishing cabinet, a mythical artifact that can transport objects to another location. "I think I should leave a report for Dumbledore," Harry thought, feeling Mrs. Weasley's gaze on the back of his head. Regretting his actions, Harry closed the drawing room door and rejoined the cleaning efforts. Mrs. Weasley was consulting a large, open book that appeared to be an illustrated encyclopedia. "This is the Household Pest Handbook, which appeared in The Mystery of the Fortress by Gilderoy Lockhart, a former Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher," she explained. "It's good for everyone, because these pests have poisonous fangs. I've already prepared antidotes, but I hope no one needs them." Mrs. Weasley stood directly in front of the curtains, ready to spray as soon as they made a move. "I hope they'll avoid us, but the instructions on this sprayer say that just one successful spray will paralyze them. Then we'll put them in this bucket," she said. Mrs. Weasley carefully stepped out of the line of fire and raised her sprayer. Harry sprayed tightly for a few seconds, and a green insect fell onto a pile of folded cloth. Its bright, beetle-like wings buzzed as it tried to close, with its small, delicate body covered in thick hair, and its tiny fists clenching angrily. Harry quickly sprayed it again with the insecticide, which made it fall onto the floor with a surprising thud. Harry picked it up and threw it into the bucket. "Fred, what are you doing?" Mrs. Weasley screamed. "Spray it immediately and toss it away," she ordered, as she saw Fred holding a struggling insect between his fingers. "All right," Fred said cheerfully, as he sprayed the insect in the face before quickly slipping it into his pocket, as soon as Mrs. Weasley turned away. We're not using insect venom to experiment with our skiving snack boxes, Fred told Harry quietly, while George moved closer and whispered, it's a range of candies that will make you sick, just enough to get you out of class. Fred and I have been developing them this summer. They have a dual effect. If you eat the yellow half, it makes you sick, but once you've left class and are on your way to the hospital wing, you swallow the purple half, and it instantly cures you, George explained. They still need some work, though. Right now, our test subjects are having a bit of trouble stopping the vomiting after swallowing the purple half. So, are you still planning to open a joke shop? Harry asked, pretending to adjust the nozzle of his sprayer. Yes, but we haven't managed to secure startup funds yet, Fred replied. Mrs. Weasley, who had been wiping her eyebrows with a scarf earlier, added, so we're operating on a shoestring budget for now. We ran an ad in the Daily Prophet last week, but don't worry, Mum didn't see it. She stopped reading the Daily Prophet after they published those lies about you and Dumbledore. The twins had secretly used the Triwizard Tournament winnings from Harry to fund their joke shop ambitions, and they were still pleased with the progress, knowing Mrs. Weasley wasn't aware of it. Mrs. Weasley never thought opening a joke shop was a good idea for her sons, and their curtain-cleaning efforts had consumed almost the entire day. Finally, Mrs. Weasley took off her protective scarf, wielding it like a sword as she inspected the now-still curtains. The buzzing has stopped, because the dense spray has softened and dampened the curtains. They are now lying in an unconscious heap next to the bucket full of black eggs. Crookshanks was purring nearby, and the Weasley brothers were greedily eyeing the bucket. In about 5 minutes, we'll have solved the problem, Mrs. Weasley pointed to either side of the room. The glass cabinets containing various mismatched items inside were still glimmering, but Mrs. Weasley noticed that they should have been symmetrical. A rusty blade, along with several silver objects, was visible. Of all the things I don't understand, the most annoying is that crystal bottle. A loud doorbell rang, and everyone turned to Mrs. Weasley, who remained calm despite the sound of Mrs. Black's screaming coming from below. I'll go get some sandwiches, she said, grabbing the bucket full of dead rats as she left the room, carefully closing the door behind her. Almost simultaneously, everyone rushed to the window, leaning over the staircase to look down. They could see Mundungus Fletcher's scruffy hair swaying unsteadily as he tried to maintain his balance while carrying a bunch of cauldrons. What do you suppose he's doing with those cauldrons? Harry asked. Probably selling them, Fred replied. Maybe it's how he managed to track me down that night, George added. Yeah, you're right, Fred said, as they watched Mundungus struggle at the front door with his load. Mrs. Weasley never liked him, but George whispered, let's listen closely to what's happening. As the shouting from Mrs. Black below subsided, Mundungus was barely keeping his balance. Fred furrowed his brow and whispered, I wonder if we should risk using the extendable ears now. George agreed, but just then, a loud crash came from downstairs. The extendable ears were no longer needed as everyone could clearly hear Mrs. Weasley shouting at the top of her lungs, thieves. There's nothing like hearing Mum shout at someone else, Fred said with a satisfied grin. He opened the door slightly and whispered, let's see what's going on. This is so beautiful, totally worth the wait. It's been a long time since you dragged in these arrogant people. Soon we'll be worrying about a lack of funds. He shook his head, saying, you have to stop him this morning, or he'll just keep talking endlessly, like boiling steam. Ever since Mundungus shirked his duty while tailing you, Mom has been wanting to find an excuse to punish him. But now you're acting like Sirius's mother. Mrs. Weasley's initial sharpness was lost as she yelled from the portrait in the hallway. George attempted to close the door to block out the noise, but before he could, Creature the house elf came into the room. He had just tied up some rats into a string and wore it around his waist. His whole body looked like loose skin, which appeared bigger than his actual frame. Although he was bald, like other house elves, his ears were like a bat's, His eyes were large and bloodshot, and his nose was enormous, like that of a black and white badger. This house elf clearly didn't notice Harry and the others, behaving as if he couldn't see them. He slowly and shakily walked to the back of the room, muttering to himself. His breathing sounded like a bullfrog croaking, or a drain gurgling, and he smelled like a saw, or a criminal. Filthy traitors bringing in their filthy offspring to my mistress's house, making a mess of things. My poor mistress, if she knew what kind of trash they brought into the coffee pot, werewolves, little thieves, poor old creature is happy. Fred suddenly closed the door loudly, saying, "What are you doing here?" The elf stopped and looked extremely surprised. "Didn't see you, little master." He turned his head towards Fred, who stood on the edge of the carpet, and added in a voice just loud enough to hear, "A system traitor, a dirty rat, a foul brat." Creature didn't say anything. The elf looked at George and added in a low voice, "This is his twin brother. They are both unusually vile." Harry didn't know whether to laugh or not. The elf's body language and malicious look made it clear he believed they couldn't hear him, so he continued, "There are still some kids here, standing shamelessly. If my mistress knew, she would cook them. And there's a new boy here. Creature doesn't know his name or why he's here. Creature doesn't know who he is." Hermes calmly said, "Harry Potter." Creature's pale eyes glinted like the lamplight, and he became more furious than before. "This kid is talking to friends and guests like this. If my mistress saw him like this, she would call him a brat with immature nonsense." "Never mind," Creature said as he walked away, "he's already in a daze. He doesn't know what he's saying." Fred said to Creature, "Don't be silly, you know exactly what you're saying." Fred noticed Creature's eyes were still fixed on Harry. "Is this true? Is this Harry Potter?" Creature muttered. "Can he really see that? This must be the boy who stopped the Dark Lord." Creature is doubtful. "Let us all go," said Creature. "What are you doing here?" Fred asked. Creature's big eyes turned to George. "Creature is cleaning," he evasively said as an excuse. Behind Harry, a voice said, "Sirius is back." He was really at the doorway, glaring at the elf. The noise from the living room had stopped. Perhaps Mrs. Weasley and Mundungus had moved their argument to the kitchen. Creature quickly bowed deeply, his pig-like nose almost touching the ground, and stood up. Sirius impatiently instructed, "Now go away." This part was purely my personal opinion, so I made this video for everyone. There is no need to make films for the blind or hearing impaired. Providing an inclusive experience allows them to get the same information and entertainment as everyone else. Hurry up and watch this video. If everyone likes it, please support this series. Your engagement is my motivation, so please remember to subscribe.